Well, good morning from Australia, good evening from America, and g'day from wherever you happen to be joining us from the rest of the world. My name is Kevin Rudd. I'm president of the Asia Society Policy Institute, normally based in New York, but currently in COVID-induced exile here in Australia. During the course of the COVID lockdown, we at the Asia Society Policy Institute in New York have been running a series of seminars online about the impact of COVID-19 on Asia and on the world. And we've been privileged in recent weeks to be joined in these conversations with the President of Iraq, with the Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund, and others, giving their insights about the impact of the virus on particular countries, particular regions, but frankly, particular challenges facing all countries, or most. Which brings us to our special guest today, and we're delighted to be joined by a friend and colleague of mine, Fareed Zakaria. Fareed joins us from New York in the United States. Fareed is known throughout the world as the host of Fareed Zakaria GPS on CNN. It's a great program. But behind that program lies Fareed the man, and Fareed brings a formidable skill set to the task of public journalism in the United States, particularly at this critical time. He is an author in his own right and a political scientist by training. And prior to joining CNN, Fareed was editor of Newsweek International for a decade, from 2000 to 2010. And prior to that was managing editor of Foreign Affairs, the prestigious magazine of international relations based in New York between 1992 and 2010. And beyond that, has written a number of best-selling titles, including The Future of Freedom, The Post-American World, and others. And so Fareed is not just a host of a significant public affairs program in the United States, and which goes globally. Fareed is also a formidable public intellectual in his own right, which is why we've kind of reversed the process today. I'm interviewing Fareed because of his insights into what is unfolding around the world with the COVID crisis. But now, what we see tragically unfolding before our eyes in terms of the riots which are now besetting America. Format today is pretty simple. Fareed and I will be in conversation through until about 40 minutes after the hour. Then for the remaining 20 minutes of this program, we'll then turn to questions which will come to us from our online audience, which I will then pose to Fareed, and we will be closing right on the hour to be respectful of people's time. So Fareed, welcome to the Asia Society Policy Institute series on COVID-19 and its impact on Asia and the world. It's very hard, Fareed, to begin a conversation about COVID and its impact on people, its impact on people's livelihoods, without turning to what is unfolding on our televisions at the moment in the streets of America, and what might be called these American riots. Now, American audiences may have their own views about what is happening and why, but we're tuning into an international audience here. And so could you give us your insights, Fareed, as to where this fits in the scale of activities that we've seen in terms of riots in America, particularly on race-related questions, over the last 50 years? Over to you, Fareed.
Well, thank you, Kevin. First of all, it's a huge pleasure and honor to be on stage, as it were, on virtual stage with you. I love the Asia Society. I wish we could do this in its beautiful location in New York, but that will have to wait for another day. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk about all the things that you want to talk about. I only hope that that it does become a real conversation, because I think one of the reasons I'm doing this is I hope I can learn from you as well as say some things myself. I always feel I don't learn anything by talking. I already know what I think. Mm-hmm. I think the way to look at what is happening in the United States is through the following prism. It is certainly the most serious set of racial protests or racially motivated protests since 1968. And if you remember, 68, 69 is the period of the assassinations of Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, campus-wide protests about Vietnam, civil rights, civil unrest. And I think that it's happening because of, I don't know, I mean, if I would say there are sort of four backdrops to keep in mind. The first is, this is America's original sin. And for foreigners, I think it's important to remind people that this is the curse at the heart of the American founding, which was the treatment of blacks. They were never treated as human beings. Sometimes I've had friends of mine who are immigrants say, well, how come other immigrants seem to do all right? And it's important to remember, this is the only group of immigrants to the United States who came in chains, involuntarily, in servitude, and were made slaves, were made property for 250 years. And then for 100 years were treated essentially like serfs in a Jim Crow system that denied them rights. And it's only been 50 years since that legacy has formally been changed. And so there is a deep, deep set of iniquities built into the system that have never really been fully addressed. I mean, I think, you can still go to the South and you will find states that celebrate the birthday of Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy. You will still find boulevards named after him. It would be like going to Germany and finding a Himmler Boulevard or something like that. So that piece of it has never really been healed. And the United States has never fully kind of grappled with it. There's been no Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as in South Africa. There hasn't been a process as in Rwanda or in Germany. The second piece of this, I think, is American policing has become extremely aggressive. I'm sure you noticed this, Kevin, when you came to New York and spent enough time that you notice it, which is American cops look like an army. Compared to any other police force in the world, they look like an invading army. They use the same weaponry. They have doctrines that are very similar. They approach the situation with that kind of almost counterinsurgency attitude. And then you layer onto it the racial component and you see what's going on. The third point I'd make, and this relates to our general conversation, there are 45 million people in the United States who are unemployed and have been unemployed for 3 months. This is now there is a lot of unemployment insurance and there are safety cushions and such, but it's a very anxiety-provoking, uneasy, stressful time where people feel lost and purposeless, and that sense of anxiety must be contributing in some measure to some of this. And the final point I would make, and this is something you mentioned in a very sharp tweet of yours recently, we've had an appalling lack of leadership at the federal level from the president. This is the kind of issue uniquely suited to presidential leadership, to moral leadership, because ultimately it's not going to get solved tomorrow. As I said, I mean, this has been a problem for the United States since its founding. And there's no magic wand anyone can wave, but you could demonstrate that you have empathy, that your heart is in the right place, that you are trying to set things in motion. A lot of what needs to happen is actually at the local level when you look at criminal justice reform, but to have a president who could articulate that. And so I think all those things came together, and the sense of, with this president, the sense of particular hopelessness that people must have felt. So I think it's a very important moment in the United States, and fascinating to me. There is a kind of resonance around the world. I mean, there are people protesting in about 20 countries in sympathy for this movement in the United States, which tells you, at some level, America still retains it has a space in the imagination of people around the world.
It's been extraordinary at the extent to which this has been catalyzed within the United States. This appalling murder of Mr. Floyd in Minnesota and then it brings together the sea and seething sentiments which you've just described in your 4 points. It becomes this explosive moment. Mass unemployment, 250 years of enslavement, and a deeply polarizing president, all in one. Speaking of the president, Fareed, what do you make of what his actual strategy is in doing, for example, what he did in the last 24 hours in Washington, and walked out in front of St. John's Episcopal Church, whenever I'm in DC, it's the church I go to, just behind the White House, you know it well, as well. And then held the Bible in his hand and issued his proclamation, whatever it was, that proclamation. So what I'm interested in is, what do you think is the operational strategy within the White House against the background of COVID-19, where, as an external observer, it strikes me that the president has been, as it were, losing the political fight in terms of the upcoming presidential elections, has been unable to manage the crisis effectively domestically. So for the benefit of our audience, could you contextualize this for us in terms of what he's seeking to do and the effectiveness of what he's doing as well, politically speaking?
So I think that if you look at what Trump's political strategy was in January, it was pretty clear. He was going to run on peace and prosperity. The stock market, everything was doing well. He was taking credit for it all. And in fact, to remind people that was a time in where he was not just being nice to China, he was lavishly praising Xi Jinping, constantly talking about what a great man he was, how he loves his country, how they were trying so hard to deal with this COVID problem that's out there. But we're working very hard with them. So I think that somebody counted there 27 different times that in just January and February that President Trump praised the Chinese government and Xi personally. Then things start to go south in exactly the way you described. COVID hits, he handles it badly. The case numbers explode. People start criticizing him for how he's handling it. And perhaps most significantly, Biden's poll numbers go up and his go down. And I think he begins to get very worried. Now, remember, he's always been worried about Joe Biden. This is why the whole Ukraine shenanigan took place. He's always thought that Joe Biden was the principal, the strongest Democrat against him. So in those circumstances, Trump seems to always go to his core strategy, which is populist nationalism. And I put an emphasis on the nationalism. So if you look at 2016, essentially that campaign was about the Mexicans, to a certain extent China. People now forget, but a lot of it was about Muslims, Muslim terrorists, Islam. And that was really Trump's genius in a way, was to recognize that the country, or certainly a part of the country, was much more interested in those conversations than about the usual Republican conversations about limited government and tax cuts and balanced budgets and things. He broke from the Reagan formula, and he said, I'm going to talk to you about, the Mexicans are taking your jobs, the Chinese are taking your factories, and the Muslims are trying to kill you. And that was, in one line, that was his message. He has now clearly decided that what he is going to do the 2020 campaign on is China. China brought us COVID. They're a terrible, nasty country. He's doubled down very strongly on immigration. This hasn't been noticed as much because there's so much going on. But the Trump administration, taking advantage of COVID, has almost tried to shut down immigration into the United States in various different ways. It's used a number of small measures, a couple of big measures, but they are trying to radically slow down immigration and force the Democrats, by the way, to defend immigrants. So what he's trying to do is force the Democrats to defend China, defend immigrants, and then this comes along. And this plays right into that strategy, which he had done a little bit of it's the sort of the whole law and order approach. It'd be interesting just to figure out what exactly the polling is telling him. I don't get the sense that it's working. I get the sense that it's actually, it's adding to the sense that he is not in control, that he is not handling his responsibilities well. I think that one would have to hope that this kind of thing doesn't get vindicated. I don't pretend to know, but just looking at that image of Trump holding the Bible. I'm not a Christian, but I grew up in India and went to Christian school my whole life. And the dominant message of Christianity, as far as I can tell, particularly the New Testament, is blessed are the poor, blessed are the oppressed, blessed are the weak. That is what the Sermon on the Mount is all about. And for him to be taking that document and really abusing the essential meaning of it by doing the opposite while laying some kind of symbolic claim to it is kind of appalling. And I hope he gets called out for it.
It's the political strategy is of the type I think that you've described, and elegantly, in terms of the Mexican play, the broader immigrant play, the China play, leaving aside the intrinsic merits or demerits of China's strategy and how it behaves at home and abroad. And now it seems, in terms of African Americans, and therefore the meta message with all three is A, it's us versus them, and B, we intend to use wedge politics to force the Democrats to defend them, the non-us. Yeah. And as you said, the political alchemy of this has been deployed by forces of political right for some time in various democracies. But I think what causes most people's jaws to drop is the exactitude with which it's deployed by this particular president. I don't think we'd describe him as a student of political science, but he certainly, as a visceral right-wing politician, understands powerfully the politics of nation and race as dispensing with the rest of what you and I would describe as Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It suffuses the lot. This brings us, Fareed, to what we actually agreed to come and discuss this morning, which was the effectiveness of democracies like America, self-proclaimed in the United States as the world's oldest democracy. Not that claim usually not accepted by most other democracies, but we entertain our American friends with this prospect and possibility. But how democracies have handled COVID-19 versus authoritarian states, and the grey zone which frankly exists between those two neat categorizations of political science. So perhaps I could throw a general question to you, is both in the identification of the problem, that is the emergence of COVID-19. Secondly, the measures taken to contain the virus. And then thirdly, where it now travels in terms of economic recovery. Give us your sense from a global perspective of the scorecard between democratic systems and authoritarian systems, large and small. Who's being most effective? Who's being least effective? Or is there no clear data emerging from what we are seeing around the world? Your thoughts on that, Fareed?
Sure, it's a fascinating question, and I think that we don't have real clarity yet because we're in the middle of the movie and we're watching and studying. But I think here's what we can say. First, let's remember this hit the democracies hardest and first. And the reason is it hit the most globalized part of the world first because it is, it is caused by travel. It is spread by travel. And of course, the most connected places in the world are the richest places in the world. And most of the richest countries in the world are democracies. And so because of that, the democracies have borne the brunt of this much more than most authoritarian regimes. If you think about, the the vast numbers of authoritarian regimes in Central Asia or the ones in Africa, still relatively sheltered. If you look at, a hierarchy of who handled it well overall, I think you'd have to say that basically the democracies come out better. There are more sterling examples of democracies that have done well than authoritarian regimes. Probably the single best country is Taiwan. Taiwan, with large population, very densely packed cities. Taipei is incredibly densely packed. Has, I think, 10 deaths, or maybe 8. The last time I saw it was 8. I think I noticed that it had gone up a little bit. 8 deaths. Hong Kong, by the way, has had 4 deaths. Very, very small number. South Korea has handled it very well and has handled the complexities of small outbreaks very well. Singapore has handled it pretty well, with the one exception of in its migrant worker population. So there you see a mixture. I don't know how you'd characterize Hong Kong, but I would point out even the places that have done well, the authoritarian regimes or the non-democracies like Singapore and Hong Kong, have not used particularly authoritarian methods. They've just been good. They've been good government. There's been, the contact tracing has been good detective work. They did not appropriate vast amounts of data from people's phones and things like that. The best places in the West, probably Germany, Denmark, Iceland, again, very democratic. Iceland, by the way, has managed to do extraordinarily well without even using masks. Now, that's partly because it's a big and sparsely populated country. Australia, your own country, has done particularly pretty well. Again, remember, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, Australia get huge numbers of visitors from China. So the fact that they were able to do so well,
and New Zealand,
given that,
as well.
Pardon?
New Zealand as well.
New Zealand as well, exactly. Given that, is particularly interesting. So I think that there's really no grounds on which to say that the authoritarian regimes did well. There is the China case, which is the big one, which I'm sure we will get to. But if you take China out of it, there's very little indication it's been handled very well. Now, of course, democracies have also done badly. Brazil probably is handling it, the worst among certainly large countries. But I'd say in general, the democracies have done pretty well, and here's why. There are 2 things that seem to matter. Having good, competent local government, and many democracies, particularly rich democracies, do have that, and trust. The ability to actually have, consistent, clear communication between the government and its people, where the people view these as legitimate, understand the concern. That process, which is so clearly works so well in the German case, you can see it from Merkel downwards, where they're communicated in a completely consistent, fact-based manner. That is, I wouldn't say it's intrinsic to democracy, but certainly there is a great deal about democracy that bolsters that. Authoritarian regimes can force you to do things, for sure, but that can produce a lot of its own foibles and tensions. And as I say, that that brings up the case of China.
Yeah, I think what I deduce from your response is that the data is at least mixed or trending in the direction of supporting, in fact, the effective systems deployed by trusted democracies. For me, the poster child in so much of this has been the Taiwanese, which, given proximity, given density of population, and I've lived in Taiwan as a kid learning Chinese, so I kind of remember what it's like, and I've been back many times. These are big cities too. Taipei is not a small town. And sure, it's not the People's Republic of China and it's not Japan, but it's 22 million people, which is twice the size of Belgium. And it's bigger than the Netherlands, and it's bigger than all of Scandinavia put together as a population on a tiny piece of real estate. They've kind of done reasonably well. So what does it go down to? It goes down to trust and capacity. I think these are the 2 subsets of what you've described. Do I trust those guys and girls on television who are saying that they are ministers responsible for public health and public safety? And are they being transparent with me? And secondly, if they're being transparent with me, do their government instrumentalities have the capacity to then protect me?
Yeah.
And so far, looking at the New Zealand response, in Australia, the state government response. In Australia, the state governments are responsible for public health. They're responsible for public education, whether schools are opened or closed, as well as obviously policing. And they've all been seen in this country to have performed particularly well. So then we're left with the puzzling democracies like America and the puzzling democracies like the United Kingdom. What went down there?
I think it's a fascinating. You put it so well. I think there are two things going on in the United States and the United Kingdom. The first is there has been a 40-year assault on government from Reagan, Thatcher onward. And as you know, while it has swept in some ways across the world, places like Australia didn't quite implement the kind of draconian cuts that took place over a 40-year period. If you think about it as the starving of investment in government, the starving of capacity, and the ethos that said, as Reagan famously said, government is not the solution, government is the problem. And it's all the way to Steve Bannon comes into the White House and he says, our goal is to deconstruct the administrative state. Well, it turns out the administrative state is what you need. That's the capacity you're describing. And I think there has been a lot of that in both Britain and the United States. But I think the other piece, going to your trust point, is Trump immediately took this and turned it into a political issue. And it inevitably divided, right? Because then you have governors saying one thing, you have the president saying something, medical experts saying something else. You had a little bit of that in Britain as well, more so in America. But when that happens, the public doesn't feel like they're all on the same team. Everybody is under that you shatter that notion of trust. And so I think those two things account for the very bad starts. Now, to be fair, the U.S. per capita is doing about middling. It's not terrible. The U.S. always gets it is the spotlight is always on the United States of America, and so it always looks. We wash our dirty linen very publicly. But, the U.S. is sort of in the middle of the industrialized world. There are countries that have done better than it. It's not certainly at the top end we were talking about, the South Koreans, Taiwanese, and things like that. The Germans would be up there. But there are a lot of countries in Europe that have done worse than the United States. But given the resources, given the capacity, and the U.S. is home to the CDC and the NIH and all these public health agencies that the world over trusts. Given all that, the fact that it did so badly, is astonishing. And I do think that leadership matters. Johns Hopkins did a ranking of countries that were literally on their preparedness for global pandemics, and released it 2 months ago. I remember because we did a segment on this in the show. The U.S. was ranked number one. Because on paper, with the CDC, the NIH, with the incredible research labs, but as you know, Kevin, the American system is very disorganized and decentralized. Unless the White House is really in charge, controlling things, directing things, forcing these various agencies to cooperate, forcing local and state governments to cooperate, you can have all this capacity out there. But what you end up with is chaos, rather than those energies all being deployed in the right direction.
It's important, I think, as you say, Fareed, to see this in historical sweep in terms of what's happened across the West. The Reagan-Thatcher revolution killed the beast, killed Leviathan, killed the state. In the British context, the Attlean state, the Rooseveltian state in the United States, and its equivalents in other parts of the Western world. And that, rightly or wrongly, in my judgment, wrongly, because I'm a social democrat, this rolls on through the 80s and the 90s and into the noughties. And the underlying ethos is state capacity bad and inefficient, therefore defund it, privatize it to the greatest extent you can. And if you won't privatize it voluntarily, we'll kill the tax supply so you have no alternative. and these things
Exactly.
simply shrivel on the vine. So the script has been fairly universal. And I remember coming to office myself a decade or so ago in Australia saying, actually, government does good things. Government provides capacity. And in the absence of government, let me ask this question: what's the systemic alternative? And in America, people constantly, rightly, proclaim the virtues of this spontaneous philanthropic society, which has its origins in the 19th and 18th centuries, and it's generous and it's innovative and does wonderful things in pockets of America, but large swaths of the country just remain untouched. And so you bring this down to public health in America, and as someone who's lived in New York the last 5 years, I trot off to Mount Sinai, I trot off to the hospital for special surgery, I receive first-class global treatment, and 95% of Americans don't. And then you get to the bottom 50% in the income percentile, and it becomes progressively thin. And so it is across the system. So this shakiness of the public health system as a response, but shakiness also of people's trust in a system to deal with the country equitably at a time of crisis. But let's not let our authoritarian friends off the hook here. I mean, I've been looking carefully at what happened in China. And the first 3 weeks of the outbreak is a big story in itself, leaving aside all the conspiracy theories which have been perpetrated about China deliberately or accidentally allowing this virus to erupt from secret laboratories hanging about in the suburbs of Wuhan, with people dressed in bat gear in the bat cave. There has been a major problem. China did not learn effectively from SARS. The wet markets, it seems, were not closed down, despite the virtues of this authoritarian system. So they have laws to shut down wet markets post-SARS, but they're not shut down. Then we have the outbreak and this very ugly period in December, January, between the Wuhan and Hubei municipal and provincial authorities and the center, in terms of what's going on here, how much was concealed from the center, how much did the center conceal, and what then happens between the center in Beijing and the World Health Organization. And the eruption of discontent in the Chinese social media space in those critical months of January, February about, am I being lied to? And still questions about, am I being lied to about the real numbers in China? So you have that with an authoritarian system, yet next door in Vietnam, a country which barely receives any attention, despite the fact it's a big population in a small country with large cities, where as of now, there are virtually no reported deaths from COVID-19. And despite their own hardline lockdown and closing of borders, it seems to have recovered reasonably well. So within the authoritarian world, can I have some reflections from you, Fareed, about how they've actually gone?
Well, you set the scene, I think, exactly right, and described the Chinese situation exactly right. I think the only thing the things I would add are, it would probably have been tough for anyone because the virus burst on the stage, and people often forget, initially you don't know that you have a respiratory virus that is spreading very fast. You just know that there are people getting ill, and you don't quite understand why. But it's fair to say that the nature of a authoritarian system like China's depends upon the control of information and the silencing of dissent and the silencing of doubt. And that clearly played very badly for the Chinese. As you said, there's no question the local governments, Wuhan and Hubei, covered stuff up. And they were covering it up because they didn't want to spook the markets, they didn't want to spook growth, they didn't want to interfere with, as you know, there were important Chinese Communist Party meetings and gatherings taking place. This is the time of Chinese New Year. So for all those reasons, they were trying to hush it up. We then have some indication that the center was complicit. It's not entirely clear. What we do know is that they sat on the information for about a week. That's absolutely clear. That they declared an internal emergency within China but they did not inform the world. Now, you can say a week isn't that long, but remember, when you're dealing with exponential growth, that does play a big part. We would probably still have a pandemic. I think people who say that this could have been stopped, as Trump keeps saying, is highly unlikely, given how globalized the world is. If the Chinese had told us on the 14th or the 7th of January rather than the 14th, I don't know that it would have made that much difference. But it clearly is the kind of systemic flaw of China that was exposed, which is that this control and suppression of information is at the heart of the system. I don't think it's as cancerous as it was in the Soviet case with Chernobyl, but it is of the same nature, though of a different degree for a variety of reasons. The Chinese Communist Party is quite competent and responsive in ways that the Soviet Communist Party never was. But I think there's another part which often isn't talked about. Once they figured it out and started to act, they may have also massively overreacted, used enormous excessive force, done things that would turn out to be completely unnecessary. The lockdown of Hubei and Wuhan, the lockdown then of 750 million people for a long time. Then they did use very extreme, harsh measures. The quarantining of people by separating them from their families. I mean, at some level, could you say it worked? Yes, the Chinese numbers are down. But look, it's worked in Taiwan, as you point out. It's worked in South Korea. It's worked in Hong Kong. It's worked in Singapore. It worked in Australia, none of which had to do that. And I think it actually set a very bad model for the world of what you had to do to try to shut this down. I frankly think that we have had an excessive lockdown, in part because people they learned too much from the Chinese experience. And we should have kept in mind, look, this is an authoritarian government whose response to anything is going to be, kind of extreme in that measure. I think you could have had probably a more modulated lockdown. You could have, for example, quarantined older people who are much more clearly at risk. You could have allowed parts of the economy to, and we can see this when you look around other, people don't know that, for example, South Korea never shut down. South Korea never had a full lockdown. It never shut down its schools except for very brief moments. The same is true in Taiwan. There was a more variegated experience, but the Chinese approached it in this kind of brutal way that the Communist Party does. I'm not sure that I don't regard that as a great success. I also think that it came at a huge cost. Yes, COVID cases are down to almost nothing, but they're down to almost nothing in a lot of places that didn't do what the Chinese did.
So coming from out of all that, I think it's clear we have mixed report cards across the democracies and the authoritarian states. And as I've written elsewhere, no clear, as it were, ideological winner out of this. It's actually a relatively murky set of outcomes. But those of us who come from democracies, the prima facie assumption being perpetrated by a number of commentators that this is authoritarianism 1, democracy 0, in the great, football game of the century, just doesn't hold up against the data. Yeah. It's a much uncleaner set of outcomes. Let me just drill down into one aspect of that, and it comes out of questions which are being thrown to us from those who are watching the webinar, and that is on the application of the technologies of the surveillance state. Now, in China, where you've got a range of technologies at the most elementary level, people's electronic ID cards, the facial recognition at airports, as well as tracking you through your payment system of Alipay and WePay, given that China has become a virtually cashless society these days. And so I've spoken to Chinese colleagues about this. They say that, for example, when Wuhan erupted, given the volume of holiday traffic, which would normally go to Shanghai out of Wuhan, that they braced themselves for what would happen in China's largest city and certainly most traveled city. But by applying brutally these technologies, your term, brutally, but I agree with it, that the actual infection numbers in Shanghai were relatively modest, and certainly the deaths in Shanghai were relatively modest. So they would offer this as a case study that you can turbocharge the interconnection between testing, contact tracing, and then let's call it lockdown and control, only through effective universal surveillance systems, as opposed to our South Korean friends who, and our Taiwanese friends, and I think in Hong Kong as well, interesting case study, where frankly, these intrusive surveillance technologies were not used. You had old-fashioned approaches whereby a lot of it was based on highly individualized telephone contact where people's personal data was not accessed. So on where tech surveillance technology goes out of this, looking at the thrust of the questions coming in, you've looked at this in terms of the state of the American democracy more broadly, but Western democracies. Where do you think the trend line now takes us? More openness to surveillance, less openness to surveillance? Should we be more open? Should we be less open?
So I think you firstly, I agree with the way you characterized it in terms of the Chinese. It did help them. It's not clear how much you needed to do. In other words, it's not clear how. So when I've talked to health experts, they feel the single thing that the Chinese did that others did not do that helped them the most was not actually the using of cell phone data involuntarily from people. It was the quarantining of individuals. You know, in every other country, essentially you quarantine with your family. If you're suspected. In China, they broke the families apart. You were quarantined into a makeshift hotel or hostel. You were, food was left at your door for 14 days. And so they broke the chain of transmission even within families. And that's, that's impressive. And it is one of the flaws of our system where we do allow families to kind of huddle together, as I'm sure mine and yours are doing. It wasn't so much the cell phones as it was that. And that is fair to say that would be hard to do in a democracy. But again, I say, a lot of this, you get 85 to 90% of the bang without having to do the authoritarian measures, is my point. It's not that they don't work, but it's not clear that you need them. On the issue of the cell phones and the future of digital surveillance, look, I think this is a case where the pandemic is simply accelerating a trend that was happening anyway. There's Lenin once said, there are decades where nothing happens, and then there are weeks where decades happen. And I don't know if it's weeks, but there are months here where we've just like fast forwarded this whole digital economy. And so absolutely, you are going to have more surveillance. You are going to have more surveillance that is linked to artificial intelligence, which will then be predictive in nature. And it's stunningly good, by mean effective, because what artificial intelligence is able to do is to find patterns, small patterns that you couldn't possibly understand because they're looking at hundreds of millions, billions of transactions. And so that becomes very, very valuable if you're thinking about a public health. We're at the infancy of it right now, so we don't quite see it, but you can imagine where it's going. I am comfortable with it as long as I live in a democracy. I have never been that worried about, the fact that Amazon and Google have my data. First of all, it's anonymous data. They're not really that interested in me. It's not yet that good for those of us who, I'm sure you notice this, Kevin. You buy a pair of shoes, and for the next 2 months, every ad you get is for shoes, and you want to tell that AI machine, dude, I bought the pair of shoes. I don't need shoes anymore, or whatever it is. I mean, it's still in its infancy, but it's going to get better and better. The key is, because it is these vast aggregated data sets, what the danger is that if somebody says, I want to look at you, Kevin Rudd, I can then search through those mountains of data and find out everything about you, every website you've done, every person you've been to. So there has to be a legal check on that. That is the danger. It's not, the other stuff is they're just trying to figure out what ads to give you, and they're trying to figure out when you get to a restaurant, will they start, suggesting wines for you and things like that. The danger is if somebody wants to search you and then look at all the things you've done digitally, look at your digital life. And I think that we do need very real protections on that. I think most democracies are aware of this. They exist. They need to be, I think this is an evolving process. And this is where I think there will be a big demarcation and a big difference between living life in an authoritarian regime and living life in a democracy in the 21st century. Because we do have this Orwellian prospect that the government, should it choose, can know everything about you on a scale that has never been possible before in human history.
It raises the important question, the extent to which, given our huge debate about artificial intelligence for the last several years, the extent to which AI and algorithms and algorithmic trajectories and predictions were effectively deployed in this crisis or not. Or was it a much, shall we say, cruder application and haphazard application of technologies than we anticipated or perhaps needed? And so I think that's a really interesting question.
Yes.
Given
so far, there's no evidence that AI played a very large role. I mean, it will in drug development because you do millions of iterations and things like that. But in the parts we've been talking about, in the testing, contact tracing, quarantining, there hasn't been a particularly large role. But again, I'm a big believer in the power of artificial intelligence. I think it's just that we're at the infancy.
No, I think that's true. And it's the eternal balancing act between what technology can do and the extent to which our laws and regulations and the trust put in public officials is capable of managing it in a manner which maximizes individual privacy and then maximizes the public benefit when necessary.
Exactly.
And the devil lies in the detail of when necessary. Because if you go back to your nice phrase from Lenin before, not exactly a liberal Democrat, and the Leninist state, and I'm a student of the Leninist state because I study Chinese politics as a matter of professional discipline, is that our Leninist colleagues for a long period of time have been intimately familiar with the political science literature, which you and I know well, which is income levels rise to a certain point. You get to middle income status. Guess what? The middle class actually want more than simply consuming their pork quota each week. And they aspire to a bigger, broader life, but also a bigger, broader say in the deliberations of governance and government in their countries. And so the dynamics towards what's often called peaceful transition or non-peaceful transition occurs as you head down the conveyor belt towards one level of liberal or guided democracy after another. So you know the literature and those tuning into a webinar will be familiar with it. And so every authoritarian system has been commissioning studies on how does this apply to us over time, including the Chinese system, which if you look at it, when they did Deng's reforms on reform and opening, here comes this huge additional lump of income into people's pockets. That's great. We lift them out of poverty. Now they've become middle class. Now they've become seriously rich. And by the way, many of them have joined the Communist Party. Shoot, what are we going to do about that? So this is not an abstract seminar about power. It's a real seminar about power. And we're talking about democracy in authoritarian states. So courtesy of COVID, but courtesy of broader developments, which you've just been speaking about, to what extent do the same Leninists say, Eureka, the tech has finally arrived for us to permanently control the spontaneous combustion of democratic sentiment in increasingly capitalist societies. And a further Eureka point, if we can now legitimize our control mechanisms off the back of rolling public health crises and earlier terrorism challenges, then we therefore have permanent mechanisms through which to sustain absolute or near absolute political control. I'm sure you've thought about this, but given the dynamics of democracy in authoritarian states, your thoughts about where tech takes the authoritarian democratic divide, because I've got a bunch of questions going to that.
Yeah, look, I think it's not just tech. I think that if you think about the last 20 years, what we have had is after the Cold War, we've built a kind of international order that is very open, very dynamic, and very unstable. So if you think of the number of financial crises alone that have taken place in the last 30 years, and it's not just '08. If you think about it, there was the Mexican crisis, the East Asian crisis, the Russian default, long-term capital imploding, the tech bubble bursting, right? I mean, there's been a series of these crises. You think about terrorism, it's not just 9/11, as you know, it's the stuff that happened before and the stuff after. Each of these has allowed the state to become more powerful. The pandemic is the third of these big shocks. If you think of, the geopolitical shock of terrorism, the geoeconomic shock of these financial crises, and now the biological shock of pandemics, all of them have allowed the state to accumulate greater powers. For the most part, in democracies, that hasn't been too bad, but I'm very distressed by the expansion of police power in the United States, for example, in terms of surveillance, in terms of the things that Homeland Security can do. I think in places like Turkey, Erdogan has used that very effectively to consolidate greater and greater power. People point out in the last 15 years, there's been a kind of decline in the number and the quality of democracies around the world. I think it's related to this trend because the governments have been given opportunities to do this. So technology becomes the final straw here. And I think that the crucial issue is going to be, do you have strong laws that protect individuals, that protect their privacy, protect their rights? There is an argument that dictatorships become hyper efficient and hyper effective using artificial intelligence. I see the argument, and I think that there's certainly that danger. But I tend to think that at the end of the day, it doesn't change the point you were making, Kevin, which is the Maslowian hierarchy. At some point, people don't want to be governed as pawns on a chess table. And that might mean many different things. It doesn't always mean Western liberal democracy. But I don't believe the argument that Confucianism somehow means that the Chinese are entirely content to just live their lives, allowing the Communist Party to do whatever it wants. And my strongest evidence for this is two very vibrant Chinese societies, that is Taiwan and Hong Kong, where clearly that is not true. And what is the difference between Taiwan and Hong Kong? They're richer than China. As far as I can tell, there's no cultural differences between them that are of any significance. The big difference is they're higher up on that Maslowian hierarchy, and they are both very reluctant to give up their autonomy, their individualism, their freedom. And yeah, they are more collectivist. There is that Asian-Western difference along many dimensions, but they're still very recognizably societies that value freedom and individual rights. So I wouldn't give up on democracy as yet. And I don't think that artificial intelligence means that you will have to live through that. You have to fight for it. That's for sure. You talked about the transition to democracy. I think it's worth remembering. It wasn't a peaceful transition in Taiwan. It wasn't a peaceful transition in South Korea. It wasn't a peaceful transition in the West. I mean, the absolutist monarchs of the 19th century certainly did not want democracy. There's a real struggle here. And there is human agency, and it matters. But in every one of those cases, what you found is over time, people didn't want to live, feel subjugated, feel that they had no political agency. Look, every dictatorship wants to be Singapore, because Singapore is very unusual. It has given people a lot of autonomy and a sense of individual freedom. As you know, most people don't. Singapore is actually a much more open place than people realize. For example, the internet is completely unmonitored and unregulated in Singapore. I think it's a very difficult balance to achieve. It's 5 million people, hyper efficient, hyper competent government. It does have some elements of participation through a kind of one party guided democracy and such. I think it would be very difficult for people to, that is a balance that is very hard to get to. And the Chinese have been looked, as you well know, have looked at it ever since dawn. They've sent teams of people to Singapore to figure out how does this country manage to have kind of a democracy where the ruling party always gets 80% of the seats. If they could manage that, they'll probably do that as well. I think, just as the great challenge in the Western world, I would argue, sort of getting to Denmark. How do you get to be a society like Denmark where people are happy? It's a free market society, a good safety net that is both broad but also very efficient. The challenge for every authoritarian regime is how do you get to Singapore? And the short answer is very hard.
It's interesting what you say. I've been rereading some of the Communist Party documents from the 80s and 90s. And the big debate in China at the time was this: how do you engineer a political future for China, which is Singaporean on the one hand, and with a Nordic welfare system on the other?
Yeah. Yes.
And it was actually actively discussed. I mean, how could you land at that at the end of the day? Of course, you had the Gestalt impact of Tiananmen, which was we're about to lose power. And then, of course, you had the implosion of the Soviet Union, and all of that then was interpreted as a series of learnings within the Chinese communist system.
But I think that's a very important point you made, Kevin, that very few people remember, which is that China was actively debating in the late 1980s all kinds of reform, economic, political. So when we think that there is only one future for China, and that Xi Jinping, I mean, who knows? Life is long. The guy's been in power for 5 years, or 5 or 6 years. We'll see. That what your description of the 80s, which I think so many people so often forget, tells you there's a lot going on in that black box that is the Communist Party of China.
Yeah, the internal debates are fascinating, including bringing us back to the subject about the response to COVID-19, the effectiveness of the party in responding to that. I mean, often those of us in the West look at the Chinese propaganda apparatus, the wolf warriors, etc., and say, it's clear that the line is everything is fine and dandy and neat and under control. Those of us who study the system for a while understand that it's less like that. Also, your important historical reflection, Fareed, about Taiwan. When I was a kid there, it was still martial law. And I remember I used to live because I had no money at this center at the not far from Taiwan University, called the KMT, Anti-Communist Recover the Mainland International Youth Activity Center. And let me tell you, on Friday night we had to watch KMT propaganda movies. That was part of the deal. I don't think it had a huge effect on me, but it's kind of interesting. And then you went through the emergence of what's called the DPP, Democratic Progress Party, and then the horrendous idea that in fact these guys might get elected. And they did, and Tsai Ing-wen's their second sort of significant term. It's a very untidy process. Fareed, the only last question I've got, and we've got 2 minutes to go, so I'll give you a 60-second quick hit on this, which is the World Health Organization's copped a lot of criticism, some of it justified perhaps, and a lot of it not. Your reflections on how they have performed so far, and then I'll draw this to close in a couple of minutes' time.
I think the WHO was excessively deferential to China. I think it's fair to say that, and I think it probably was excessively deferential to China, partly because Dr. Tedros was a candidate that the Chinese had backed. I don't think they backed him, by the way, for particularly nefarious reasons. He was a very competent minister of health in Ethiopia. But the bigger issue is, why were they so deferential outside of that personal issue? It's because the WHO, like all UN agencies, as you well know, are defined by their subservience to the member states. They are not supranational world government bodies. They are required to be deferential to member states. They have no enforcement authority. They have no disciplining authority. They have no punishment authority. And so they rely for the member states on cooperation, and they probably are particularly reliant on the large donors. This is most true, by the way, of the United States. The WHO is incredibly deferential to the United States. That is the nature, and it may be a flaw, but it is the original flaw of the system of international cooperation we have. Now, I would argue, just a final closing thought, what this pandemic shows us is that we have real problems in the world, and they are all global. They are by nature global. And pandemic is, by definition, it's a global, it doesn't worry about borders. It doesn't worry about your race, ethnicity, caste, creed. Clearly, we need global solutions. And the answer is not that the WHO should be defunded, is it should be structured in a way that it would have the authority the next time around to be able to have the capacity to push back in some way, not just against China, but against every government, including the United States, which is, of course, why it doesn't have it, because the United States has never wanted a UN agency to have that kind of authority.
It's a really interesting point to conclude on, because it goes back to different notions of the state in the West, and the Reagan-Thatcherite, and I've got to say Australian conservative critique that we don't want powerful global institutions. It undermines our local political autonomy. And yet, in the event of COVID, I noticed the conservative Australian Prime Minister says what we need is a much more powerful WHO. Well, let's just reflect on the ideological consistency of that proposition. And maybe we don't want to kill Leviathan after all. That same Leviathan, that mega state that actually runs health systems domestically and runs international health organizations who, with mandate and funding, could do a more effective job in the future. Fareed, you've been very generous with your time. We've ranged broadly over the appalling riots in America, which friends of America around the world, their hearts bleed at the moment, watching the suffering that's happening there. We've ranged over COVID-19 and the respective responses by authoritarian states and democracies, and a few random conclusions about the WHO on the way through. So thank you so much, Fareed Zakaria, for your time. The Asia Society Policy Institute owes you a debt of gratitude, and to all those who have tuned into this webinar, thank you for your attention as well.
It was a great pleasure, Kevin. Thank you.